So I'm going to give you a taster of the history of the department, mainly before it became into being. So as you can see from the title of the talk, it's a short history of child health in Oxford. And short is in brackets because, as the Vice-Chancellor said, 200 years is quite short in Oxford terms. But it was long in what it took to get to the stage of an academic department. And it wasn't just a case of waiting for one little child to grow up and lead the department. Don't know if you can recognise who this might be. So caring about children and their health has taken some time. Today we take it for granted that children's hospitals and specialised medicine exist. This had been really needed because it was against hospital rules to admit children routinely, and there was a lack of facilities dedicated to the care of sick children in Britain. 1 in 3 children were dying at the beginning of the 19th century, and child mortality didn't improve dramatically until the next century. So focusing on the needs of the children was new and much needed. Infectious diseases of childhood were a major cause of death. And in the past, children were mainly cared for in the home, or orphaned or abandoned children often ended up in infant asylums where the mortality rate could reach up to 100%. Government didn't see it as their remit to meddle with family or local affairs and take away from parental responsibility. So focusing on the needs of the children was new and much needed. Britain was also much slower compared to the rest of Europe. So the development of specialised children's hospitals was about half a century behind major European cities like Paris. And it was only the beginning of the 20th century that we saw professors of paediatrics, academic departments, professional associations, and physicians dedicated to children. So what happened to get to our own academic department? So concentrating on the people and events before the department's founding, I found a strong heritage, but also some haphazard beginnings, which remind us now what we've fought hard for. And thanks for everyone who's inputted into this history project, especially Richard Moxon, and for all the people that I've interviewed across the department who gave me a really good flavour of both the past and the current picture. So to start off with, I want to show you a video which summarises this very rich grounding of the department before its founding in 1972. So this video concentrated on some of the scientific achievements, but I also want to go back further to the beginning when children were just starting to be treated separately by the medical community in Victorian Oxford. So today we're on the grounds of the Radcliffe Infirmary, which was Oxford's first modern hospital, opened in 1770. Children under 7 and pregnant women were in fact banned from the hospital, which was normal practice at the time, and they were only admitted for major surgery and emergencies. And then it was a doctor who returned from Great Ormond Street in London, Jules Ralston, who petitioned for a children's ward, and he needed to do some persuading. So we can take a look at Jackson's Oxford Journal, the local newspaper, to see how the rationale for this new ward was being put back then. And this was an article after the ward had already been opened, explaining why it was needed and how it was especially adapted for children. That they should be allowed to be admitted at any time because cases of disease were acute for them, and where an ailment was harmless for adults, it could be fatal for children. And so this new ward was only 12 beds. Unfortunately, a women's ward had to be taken over, but that was still a better situation than ending up in the men's ward and getting in the way and having inadequate treatment. So then what happens next? Well, the ward promptly burns down. And this was probably caused by fumigation that was used at the time to deal with diphtheria and fevers, not that it would have helped very much. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough money for the refurbishment until Martha Coombs steps in. And her husband had been a partner at Oxford University Press. She became a big benefactor for good causes. Her generous funding allowed for a purpose-built ward to be opened by Prince Leopold to much fanfare in 1877. The new ward was designed by a renowned architect, and it was in white brick spanning 2 floors with 8 brass beds, a nurse's room, baths and a kitchen. There was even some concern for toys. A day room was going to be well supplied. So this was a photo in the 1920s, and also showing how children would be brought out onto balconies as fresh air was thought to be beneficial. In the 30s, we start to see more toys, and then by the late 1930s, it was much lighter in the ward. So the next move would be an emergency wartime hospital in Reichardt, and then the Churchill Hospital, which was opened in the Second World War for air raid casualties, but then that proved unnecessary. So after being passed to the US military, it was gifted to Radcliffe Infirmary. And there a children's ward was opened. And the Churchill was only meant to be temporary, but as we know, it's still just about standing today. The first dedicated children's hospital was Park Hospital for children's psychiatric care. And it had been the Grand Mansion, Highfield Park, and then a neurosis unit. So that was run by Dr. Christopher Kit Ousted, and he described his work there as developmental medicine. The hospital closed in 2006 with the opening of the West Wing at the John Radcliffe Hospital. So that was an overview of mainly the institutions and the bricks and mortar. And I'd like to concentrate next on 2 pioneering Oxford paediatricians who made an early mark, Dr. Cicely Williams and Dr. Victoria Smallpiece. And these are 2 remarkable women. One did her medical education in Oxford and went out to the wider world, and the other came to Oxford from London and never left. So both made a significant mark. Beginning with Cicely Williams, she was the first of the female medical students in Oxford to graduate, and that was because of World War I and women being allowed to replace male medical students. So she was originally from Jamaica, and her father had told her, "You'd better become a lady doctor because you're unlikely to find a husband," which I suppose was meant to be some form of encouragement at the time, when female doctors were virtually non-existent. She had a career in what was described as tropical paediatrics. So she took up a post in the British Colonial Service, and then ironically, because of the return of the male doctors after World War I, she found it difficult to get a position. And she was given a special post as Woman Medical Officer. And this was not to mark out her distinction as a woman, but in order to pay her less. So in her first posting in the Gold Coast, now Ghana, she identified the protein deficiency disease, kwashiorkor, and her next post was in Malaya, now Singapore, in the 1930s. And there she gave a speech at the Rotary Club against the aggressive marketing of companies promoting substitutes for human breast milk. During World War II, she was interned in a prison where bad conditions meant she lost a third of her body weight. But she was still pleased that the babies born there under her care survived, and she'd encouraged them to be breastfed. Dr. Victoria Smallpiece had a similarly illustrious career, mostly based in Oxford. And she was an early female graduate who went on quickly to become an Oxford GP. She had an all-women's doctor's surgery, which was quite unusual, with many artists attending, and this was on Broad Street where Blackwell's is today. During World War II, she ran the Children's Hospital in Rycote, and she was the first full-time paediatrician at the children's ward at the Churchill in 1945. She was running this department almost single-handedly until 1949 and seemed to have quite an unmanageable workload. She was also working for free at many points for the needy. She then worked on early enteral feeding, and then after her retirement, she published on urinary tract infection in childhood. So moving on to paediatric research and discovery, which we touched upon in the video, Dr. Williams had identified the protein deficiency disease in 1929. Later in 1963, Professor Sir David Hull and Dr. Michael Dawkins discovered a tissue in newborns to retain warmth. Oops. And next, in 1964, Dr. Palmer Davies and Dr. Victoria Smallpiece introduced early enteral feeding with human milk for preterm babies. So that was going against the dogma at the time that these babies couldn't be fed immediately. In 1968, Professor David Baum invented a heat-preserving foil sheet called the silver swaddler, and that was protecting premature babies from heat loss. And in 1972, Dr. Jeffrey Dawes confirmed that human fetuses sleep in cycles. So finally, to move on to the founding of the department in 1972. At the same time, many of the children's services at the Radcliffe Infirmary relocated to the John Radcliffe Hospital. And the department began with a donation from the charity Action Research, which also endowed the Professor of Paediatric chairs for Sir Peter Tizard, Professor Richard Moxon, and Professor George Hollander. Peter Tizard became the first Professor of Paediatrics in the University of Oxford, and he made contributions to neonatology and paediatric neurology. He promoted the acceptance of paediatrics when adult medicine was dominating healthcare policies. Following him was Professor Richard Moxon, and as an internationally renowned vaccinologist, he conducted innovative work using genomics, which has led to vaccines against meningitis, among other diseases. And as we heard, he also founded Oxford Vaccine Group, establishing a Centre for Vaccine Research in Oxford. And this year was recognised with the Royal Society Buchanan Medal. And there were also some important early appointments. Professor David Baum was recruited as a lecturer when the department was founded. I mentioned his invention of the silver swaddler. And later in 1982, with nun Sister Frances, he founded Britain's first children's hospice, Helen House in Oxford. In 1981, Professor Andrew Wilkinson was appointed consultant for the first subspecialty appointment in the NHS Children's Services, and he's been an international authority on neonatology. Professor Peter Sullivan joined in 1994, and he was head of department from 2008 to 2015, running the tertiary referral service for paediatric gastroenterology and nutrition in the Oxford region. So this all leads up to today, with the department hosting research programs from early proof of concept all the way up to application in clinical settings, some of which takes place in the new Children's Hospital at the JR. And we're going to hear next from different parts of the department about their groundbreaking research. Thank you very much.